I want to thank all of you for being here, first of all. And I'd like to begin by asking you all a question. What do you think when you hear the words world peace? When you hear the words world peace, what comes to mind? World peace. When you hear world peace,
infinite energy.
Justice.
Dialogue.
Dialogue, right? What else comes to mind?
Happiness.
Happiness, right? What else comes to mind?
Understanding.
Understanding. Harmony, right?
Disarmament.
Disarmament. Great points, great points. Now, what do you think most Americans think when they hear the words world peace? They think beauty pageants, right? They think naive, impossible. They think beauty pageants. Have any of you seen the movie Miss Congeniality?
Yes.
With Sandra Bullock. There's a movie called Miss Congeniality with Sandra Bullock. And there's a scene in the film where there's a beauty pageant, and an interviewer asked the beauty pageant contestants what they want, and they all say world peace. And it's supposed to be a joke, right? Because world peace is supposed to be a joke. But is it? So we have to keep in mind that the whole military-industrial complex is built upon this idea that world peace is naive, and world peace is a joke, and war is inevitable. Because if you believe that world peace is naive and world peace is a joke and war is inevitable, then your society has two choices. You can be the conqueror, or you can be the conquered. You can be Rome, or you can be Carthage, where all the women and children are killed and sold in slavery. And if you believe that world peace is naive and a joke and war is inevitable, then you have to become the best at the use of military force to ensure your own survival. Right? So it's a very Hobbesian and Machiavellian way of looking at the world. They lived many centuries ago. They had very limited access to information. And we'll talk about all the things that we know today that they did not know. So I can tell you what I thought about world peace when I was growing up, because I didn't grow up in the peace movement. So for a long time, I thought that world peace was a naive dream. My father served in the army for 30 years, and he fought in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. My mother lived in Japan during World War II, and she lived in Korea during the Korean War. I graduated from West Point. I served in the army for 7 years. I was deployed to Baghdad, and I left the army 2 years ago as a captain. But what if I told you that I learned at West Point and in the army that world peace is possible? Furthermore, a simple question can help us understand whether world peace is possible or whether world peace is a naive dream. And that question is, are human beings naturally violent or naturally peaceful? If human beings are naturally violent and war is something that we're supposed to do, then it would be naive to assume that world peace would ever happen. But if human beings are naturally peaceful, and we have to be trained and conditioned to become violent, then world peace just might be possible. World peace just might have a chance. So please raise your hand if you think human beings are naturally violent. Please raise your hand if you think human beings are naturally peaceful. Okay. Please raise your hand if you think human beings are naturally violent and naturally peaceful. Okay. Those hands go up on that. Can you all hear?
Yes.
Can all of you hear fine? Okay. Okay. Can anybody turn the mic up a little bit? Okay. So, now that's actually a very counterintuitive idea, that we're not naturally violent. And I'll give you a couple other examples of counterintuitive ideas. So, the idea that the Earth goes around the sun, very counterintuitive. If you were to go back 2,000 years and try to explain to somebody that the Earth goes around the sun, would that be an easy or a hard thing to do?
Hard.
Very hard. Because if the Earth goes around the sun, why don't we feel a sense of motion? Why don't we feel motion? And you can't tell people back then, well, it's like being on a train or an airplane, because they don't have trains and airplanes. And if you're on a horse or on a ship, it's bumpy. And if the Earth goes around the sun, why, when you look at the sky, why does it look like everything goes around you? Very counterintuitive. Another counterintuitive idea is the Earth is round. If you were to go back 2,000 years ago, would it be easy or hard to explain that the Earth is round?
Hard.
It would be very difficult. Because if the Earth is round, if you have a ball, if the Earth is round, why don't the people on the bottom fall off the Earth? Why don't the people on the sides slide off the Earth? And why does the Earth look flat? Looks flat. Very counterintuitive idea, right? And the idea that we're not naturally violent is very counterintuitive. Because if we're not naturally violent, why is there so much war? Why is there genocide? Why is there murder? Another counterintuitive idea is the idea that war makes us safe. This is why you can't talk about the military budget with most people, because we're taught in our society that war protects our freedom, and war protects our family, and war protects liberty. So if you tell people we should cut the military budget, in their mind, you are threatening their liberty and their freedom and their family. So before you can talk about cutting the military budget, you first have to show people not only does war not make you safe, it makes you less safe. Very counterintuitive idea. It's counterintuitive like the Chinese finger trap. The harder you pull, the more stuck your fingers get. You think the more you project military force, the safer you are, but the more you project military force, the less safe you are. So if you see how the military-industrial complex is built upon these fundamental assumptions that are incorrect. We're naturally violent. Therefore, war is inevitable. Why not be the best at it? It's going to happen anyway. Why not be on the delivering rather than the receiving end? And war makes us safe. It protects our freedom. And we'll talk about why these are illusions and why they're not true. So I want to begin by asking all of you a question. What is the greatest problem of every army in world history? Every army in world history, no matter what time period or culture, has a single greatest problem. Anyone guess what that problem is?
To make soldiers kill.
Great answers. Feeding soldiers, big problem. Keep in mind, armies have lots of problems. Feeding soldiers, logistics, supply, recruiting. Another great answer, teaching soldiers to kill. All great answers. But there's an even bigger problem than those.
What about deciding when enough war is enough?
Deciding when enough war is enough, that's a good point. And what I'm talking about, the problem I'm talking about is a bigger problem than the opposing army. Because if you don't solve this problem, you won't have a chance to fight the opposing army. Desertion? Very close. The greatest problem of every army in world history isn't getting soldiers to kill, although that is a big problem. The greatest problem of every army in world history is getting soldiers to die. Most people don't want to get their heads cut off, or get stabbed, or get shot. So, the greatest problem of every army in world history is, when a battle begins, how do you stop soldiers from running away? In combat, our flight response is far more powerful than our fight response. Most people's natural reaction, when you try to stab them with a sword or shoot them with a rifle, most people's natural reaction is to run away as fast as they can, as far as they can. Ask anyone who's been in combat and they will tell you it's terrifying. And General Patton said anyone who's not afraid in combat is a liar. So if I go out to the street and I pull a shotgun on somebody, their instinct is to run from me, not to fight me. If I pull a knife on somebody, their instinct is to get out of the situation, not to attack me. Most people. So how did armies throughout history learn to make soldiers fight and not retreat?
Propaganda.
Basic training. Demonizing, right? There's many techniques, right? But the technique is so simple, people often don't see it. It's so simple. Everything in your body says, don't get stabbed. Don't get shot. Don't get blown up. And how can you make soldiers willingly die? Willingly die. There it goes, right there. Somebody said it. Somebody said it. Let me answer that question by asking all of you a question. What would all of you die for? Raise your hand if you would risk your life to protect your family. See? Do you ever wonder why the army has the whole band of brothers and camaraderie and brotherhood? It's out of military necessity. And I think Lao Tzu, a Chinese philosopher, said it best when he said, by being loving, we're capable of being brave. The Greeks realized that if soldiers believe they are fighting to protect their friends, their family, and their loved ones, they will not only fight, but they will even sacrifice their lives. Because our instinct to protect our loved ones is far more powerful than our instinct for self-preservation. Think about how you would react if you saw your loved ones being attacked. Think about how you would rush to their aid and try to protect them. So I heard a story a few years ago on the radio that illustrates this point. There's a story about an 80-year-old woman, and she's walking down the street, and there was a loose pit bull running toward her. So what would you do if you're walking on the street and there's a loose pit bull running toward you? What would you do? What would you want to do? A loose pit bull. You're walking down the sidewalk and there's a loose pit bull running right at you. What would your instinct be? To run, right? Your instinct isn't to attack the pit bull. That's madness, right? It's madness. It's fighting a pit bull is madness. And what if there's a tree right next to you? What would your instinct be? Climb a tree, right? What if you're right next to a house? Go in the house, right? But this story was about an 80-year-old woman, and she was walking her little poodle, and the pit bull ran up and clamped its jaws on her poodle, and the 80-year-old woman bent down and bit the pit bull on the neck until the pit bull let go. Now, think about that. Think about how the dynamic changes. If it's you and the pit bull, you're terrified. You think about running and personal safety. But imagine your daughter or your son or your granddaughter or your grandson or your brother or your sister or your best friend or your parent or your spouse being attacked by a pit bull. You go berserk. You would grab a stick or a rock, try to club the pit bull over the head. When the dynamic changes and your loved one is in danger, then you lose concern for personal safety. And you're more focused on protecting your loved one. So armies require camaraderie and brotherhood in order to function. At West Point, I learned a famous passage from Shakespeare's Henry V, which reads, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother." West Point also taught me to treat my military unit like my family. And your military unit becomes your family. You live with these people. And Army training puts you in situations where you have to trust them with your life, where you have to sacrifice for each other, and where you can't get anything done without teamwork and cooperation. And then in combat, you're put in a situation where if you retreat, the people who have become your family will die, and you have to fight to protect the people you care about. So the Army makes these families. Then it puts them in the situations where people are trying to kill their family, and then people kill the opposing side. That's the effective way to do it. Have any of you seen the movie Forrest Gump? Why did Forrest Gump risk his life to save Bubba in the Vietnam? They're best friends, right? So the Army makes soldiers love each other, and then they will die for each other. So love of comrades is one psychological technique that the Greeks used to make soldiers fight and not retreat. Another psychological technique that the Greeks used was love of country. Love of country. Have any of you heard of the Battle of Thermopylae? Battle of Thermopylae during the Persian War. During the Persian War, the decisive battle was not the Battle of Thermopylae, where the Spartans were defending a pass against the Persians. The decisive battle was the Battle of Salamis, where the Athenian general Themistocles had to defeat a very large Persian navy with a very small Greek navy. So imagine how frightening it is to have one person trying to kill you. Now imagine being outnumbered 3-1, 4-1, 5-1. So the Athenians were greatly outnumbered, and to inspire the courage to make their victory possible, the Athenians shouted the following battle cry: "Advance, ye sons of Greece! From oppression save your wives, save your children, save your country. This day the common cause of all demands your valor." Most people will die to protect their loved ones. I think many of you would die to protect your loved ones. So when the Athenians heard that, "Advance, ye sons of Greece! From oppression save your wives, save your children, save your country. This day the common cause of all demands your valor," they were ready to fight to the death. And I think that battle cry has been used by every government since then. Not word for word, but the essence of that battle cry. Because whenever a government wants to make a population go to war, they have to say that we're fighting to protect our freedom, or we're fighting to protect our way of life, or we're fighting to protect our friends, our family, and our loved ones. How many wars have there been in human history? Anybody want to guess?
It's still a little hard to hear you. I think the mic is too close down a little bit.
I was trying to speak louder, so I put it closer. So can somebody turn it up?
That's good.
Okay, this is fine. Okay. Can all of you hear me? Okay.
Close is good.
How many wars have there been in human history?
Oh, too many.
How many wars have there been in human history? Too many to count, right? Perhaps thousands. But you know, in all of military history, all of world history, there has never been a single war where a national leader told his people they're fighting for money or gold or oil. Every war, according to national leaders, is about two things: self-defense and liberating people. So think about that. If human beings are naturally violent, why would the greatest problem of every army in world history be when a battle begins, how do you stop soldiers from running away? And why would governments have to manipulate our love in order to make us go to war? If we were naturally violent, governments could just say, "Look, you're violent, I'm going to pay you to go kill people." Right? Imagine you're a poor Roman farmer. Imagine you're a poor Roman farmer 2,000 years ago. And the Roman emperor, he says to you, "I want you to go to war. And the worst case scenario for you is you die, and your wife becomes a widow, and your children become orphans. And the best case scenario for you is you come back to your farm." A Roman farmer is going to say, "Are you crazy? Why am I going to go do that?" But what if the Roman emperor says, "If you don't go to war, these evil people will come kill your family, and take away your farm, and take away your freedom, and take away your way of life"? Then he's going to fight. It's another question. What does war do to the human mind? What does prolonged exposure to war do to the human brain? traumatizes the brain, right? Traumatizes the brain. Have all of you heard the saying, war is hell? War is one of the most traumatizing things a human being can go through. War drives people insane. So if human beings are naturally violent, why would war traumatize so many people? If human beings are naturally violent, why would war drive so many people insane? Think about why there's so many soldier suicides and PTSD cases, right? And veterans addicted to drugs and homeless. If we were naturally violent, you go to war and your mental health just steadily improves over time. And you're not in war and you start going crazy because you haven't had enough war. But the opposite happens. You put people in prolonged exposure to war and their brains fall apart. That's why they have to rotate soldiers in and out of combat. Because they can't just leave them there year after year after year. They have to rotate them in and out because their minds can't handle continuous combat. That's an adaptation the military actually did after World War II. To decrease PTSD, rotate soldiers in and out. But if we're naturally violent, leave them there and their mental health will just keep improving. So there was a study done by Swank and Marchand. Swank and Marchand were two medical doctors in World War II. One of them was at D-Day, and they did this study right after World War II, and they found that after 60 days of sustained day-and-night combat, 98% of soldiers become psychiatric casualties. After 60 days of sustained day-and-night combat, 98% of soldiers suffer psychiatric trauma. Keep in mind, 60 days of sustained day-and-night combat is a 20th century phenomenon. Because prior to World War I, soldiers typically took the nights off. And how long was the Battle of Gettysburg?
3 days.
A few days, right? Battles back then didn't last very long. They last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days. But in World War I and onward, you had a situation where soldiers were trapped in combat. They were trapped in continuous day and night combat, artillery bombardment. And this study found that after 60 days of sustained day and night combat, 98% of soldiers become psychiatric casualties. But 2% of soldiers can be exposed to war for long periods of time and kill and kill and kill and never go insane. So why is that 2% different? Why can 2% of soldiers be exposed to war for long periods of time and never go insane, and why can the other 98% not do that? What the study found is that the reason why 2% of soldiers are never driven insane by war is because they were already insane before they went to war. That 2% is composed of aggressive psychopaths, according to the study. And fortunately for us, they're the 2%, not the 98%. There's a really good book called On Combat, written by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Roseman. He trains FBI, Special Forces, Marines, Army. He says the first thing you have to know about combat, is combat is an environment that is toxic to the human brain. The human brain is not designed to be in combat. That's why you need training, military training, martial arts training, police training, to train people to function in combat, in violent situations. Even look at James Lawson and the civil rights movement. They would train people to function in violent, contentious situations. It needs training because the mind isn't naturally built to handle that. Another question. During World War II, what percent of soldiers in combat who had a chance to shoot at the enemy actually fired the weapons at the enemy? During World War II, what percent of soldiers in combat who had a chance to shoot at the enemy actually fired their weapons at the enemy? 50%? 10%. 20? Close. It's about 15%. About 15. A lot lower than what most people think. Now, during the Vietnam War, what percent of soldiers in combat who had a chance to shoot at the enemy actually fired the weapons at the enemy?
90%.
Actually fired what?
Actually fired the weapons at the enemy.
90%.
It was about 90%. About 90%. That's a drastic change in a short amount of time, right? During World War II, about 15% of soldiers in combat who had a chance to shoot at the enemy fired the weapons at the enemy. During the Korean War, it's about 55%. During the Vietnam War, it's about 90%. Today, it's nearly 100%. So what happened? What happened to cause that drastic change in such a short amount of time? Training. That's it, training. The key term is training. What happened was the Army got better at training people how to kill.
Brainwashing.
We'll talk about that. But the key term is, brainwashing is too amorphous of a term. We need
Video games.
more precision. Because there's many different kind of techniques that are used. But brainwashing is too vague. So we're going to talk about some specific techniques. Because brainwashing is just too amorphous, too vague. So what happened was the Army got better at training people how to kill. The key term is training people how to kill. Killing is not nearly as easy as Hollywood makes us think. Most people have a very difficult time killing another human being, and armies must expend enormous effort in order to train people how to kill. And this problem goes back way before World War II. During the Civil War, soldiers spent 95% of their time loading their rifles and 5% of their time aiming and firing their rifles. So you would think that if thousands of rifles had been recovered from soldiers killed in combat during the Civil War, then most of them would not be loaded. But after the Battle of Gettysburg, they recovered about 27,000 rifles. 24,000 of the rifles, 90%, were loaded. 12,000 of the rifles had more than one bullet loaded in the barrel. 6,000 of the rifles had 3 to 10 bullets loaded in the barrel. And one of the rifles had 23 bullets loaded in the barrel. So do you see what was happening? Soldiers were loading their rifles over and over again, so it would look like they were doing something, but they weren't firing. Now, what is it about military training that makes soldiers such effective killers? What is it about military training that makes them so effective? Dehumanizing? Good point. Dehumanizing. The next point we'll talk about is all about dehumanization. That's the whole next topic. And if they kill you, if you don't kill them, they'll kill you. That was what it was during the Civil War and World War II. But they found that if you don't do the right training techniques, people freeze. Right? They just freeze. They don't know what to do, and they panic. And they can't kill. Practice. Practice, exactly. Something called reflex training. Reflex training. Anybody here ever heard of reflex training? Let me explain what reflex training is. Let's say that I walk out to the street and I try to punch some random person. And the person has no martial arts or boxing training. What are 99% of people going to do? They're going to flinch, right? Flinch. Close your eyes, protect your face. That's a very smart reaction. It's a natural reaction, and it's a very smart reaction because when your face is going to get hit, you protect your eyes, close your eyes, protect your face. Very vulnerable part of your body. Natural reaction is you flinch. Now let's say that every day for 3 hours a day, I punch a boxing bag. Every day for 3 hours a day, I hit a punching bag as hard as I can. And I do that for a year. Every day, 3 hours a day for a year, I hit a punching bag. Now what am I going to do if someone tries to hit me in the street? I'm going to flinch. Because the punching bag doesn't hit me back. Right? The punching bag doesn't hit me back. I can hit a lot harder. But I still have that reflex. The natural reflex of flinching. So I hit a punching bag, I can hit really, really hard, but if someone tries to hit me, I still flinch. Now let's say that every day for 3 hours a day, I have a martial arts training partner, and I have him simulate punching me. And every time he simulates punching me, I evade and I counterattack. Simulates punching me, evade, counterattack. I do that every day for 3 hours a day for a year. And we do sparring. Real life punching and kicking, sparring, with pads. Now what will happen if someone tries to hit me? I'm going to evade and counterattack because it has become a reflex now. It's become a conditioned automatic response, right? So I'll give you a story to explain how powerful reflex training is. This explains how powerful reflex training is. In that book on combat, there's a story about 2 police officers. And the first police officer, he wants to train how to disarm a gunman. So he has his training partner pull a gun on him. He disarms it, gives it back to him. Training partner pulls a gun on him, he disarms it, gives it back to him. Pulls a gun on him, disarms it, gives it back to him. Does it thousands and thousands of times. Disarms it, gives it back to him. Repetition. So what happens, they're in a real life situation. You know where this is going. And they're in a convenience store, and a robber pulls a gun on him. Without thinking, the police officer disarms it, gives it back to him. That's how powerful the reflex training is. You can train people to do the wrong thing. You can train people to do things that will get them killed. Another story he talks about is at the pistol range. Police officers, after they fired their ammunition, they would get down and pick up the brass and put it in their pockets. Pick up the brass and put it in their pockets. And in real gunfights, in the middle of the gunfight, police officers were found with brass in their pockets, and some dead officers were found with brass in their hands. So you're in the middle of a gunfight, and you're picking up brass off the ground. Because when your brain is in that severe life and death stress situation, your brain, the critical part of your brain that thinks rationally shuts off. And you're just going to go back to your reflex. Because in that severe life and death situation, your brain can't think. So whatever you train people to do, in combat, in training, they will do in combat. And you see reflex training in the civil rights movement, where they train people not to react. Look at the James Lawson training, where they train people, they're getting hit, they're getting spit on, and they train them to have the conditioned reflex of not reacting, not attacking back, not fighting back. That's another form of reflex training, training people not to react. Takes a lot of repetition. So, another question. Have any of you read a book called On Killing, written by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman? Same guy who wrote On Commerce. Okay. It's a book all about killing. It's a book all about killing human beings. And it's one of the most uplifting books you will ever read, because it shows that killing is a learned behavior. Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman was a West Point psychology professor and Army Ranger, and he wrote a book called On Killing, the Psychological Cost of Learning to Kill in War and Society. I'll say the subtitle again, The Psychological Cost of Learning to Kill in War and Society. So his premise is that it is not natural for human beings to kill other human beings. That challenged everything I had ever been taught growing up. Everything I was taught growing up, you watch the action movie, the hero kills 100 people, 200 people, 300 people, no remorse, everything's fine. And here he's saying that we have a natural aversion to killing human beings. And killing is a learned behavior. We're not just innately trying to kill each other, like the Thomas Hobbes view of human nature. Now, other animal species also have a natural aversion to killing their own species. For example, a rattlesnake. A rattlesnake will bite every other animal with its lethal fangs. When rattlesnakes fight each other, what do? They wrestle. They wrestle. They don't bite each other. If you look at the king cobra will bite every other animal with its sharp teeth. And they actually eat other snakes. When king cobra fight other king cobra, what do? They wrestle. They don't bite each other. When you look at buffalo, bulls, deer, any animal with horns, when they fight other animals, they try to gut the animal. So, for example, an African buffalo, when it fights a lion, it tries to gore the animal from the side. It tries to gut the animal, attack it from the flank. But when African buffalo fight each other, they fight head to head. The least lethal form of combat. Think about hyena, leopards, wolves, tigers. Most predators, when they fight other animal species, they go for strangulation and abdominal bites. If you want to kill an animal, you bite the neck, you bite the abdomen, most vulnerable parts of the body. When they fight their own species, they tend not to go for strangulation bites. So, for example, if you look at wolves or dogs, when they show submissiveness, they roll over and show their belly. And the other animal instinctively knows not to attack it. Or if you look at two bears fighting, the way they know the fight ends is one bear turns its back, showing its vulnerable part, and the other bear knows it's won and the fight ends. Now, here's the thing. Why do animals have this natural aversion to killing their own species? Why does an African buffalo fight a lion by attacking its flank? And why, when African buffalo fight each other, why do they fight head-to-head, the least lethal form of combat? What's the reason behind that? Self-preservation. Self-preservation of the species. African buffalo spend most of their time around what animal? African buffalo, right? If they fought each other the way they fought lion, they'd go extinct. And human beings spend most of their time around what animal? Human beings, right? So doesn't it make sense that we might have a natural aversion to killing our own species? But what evidence do we have? What evidence do we have? The evidence we have is all of military history. All of military history proves this. So in On Killing, Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman says that in order to wage war, a country must betray the enemy in a certain way. And every country in history must do this, and has done this with no exceptions. Can any of you guess what that way is? How must a country betray an opposing group of people in order to wage war against them?
Dangerous.
Inhuman. Subhuman. You must dehumanize them. So go back. How many wars have there been in human history? Thousands, right? There has never been a single war in human history, not one war, that has not involved dehumanization. That's pretty convincing evidence that there's something in human nature where we don't want to kill people we think are like us. They're evil, or they're terrorists, or they're gangsters, or they're crowds, or they're jacks, right? Something in human nature has this aversion, and every war in history, without one exception, has had some form of dehumanization to perpetuate the war. And this is done through what Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman calls distance. And he talks about three kinds of distance. The first form of distance is psychological distance. Psychological distance means portraying people as subhuman. And this is often done through derogatory name calling. And in On Killing, Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman talks about how our own country has used derogatory name calling in war to portray people as subhuman. So what do we call the Germans when we fought them? Krauts, right? What do we call the Japanese when we fought them? Japs, right? And keep in mind there's multiple racial slurs for every ethnic group. There's multiple racial slurs for every ethnic group. I'm half Korean, a quarter white, and a quarter black, and I grew up in Alabama, so I've heard a lot of them. And what do we call the Vietnamese when we fought them? Right, gooks, primarily gooks, right? And what do we call the people that we're fighting now in the Middle East? What do you always hear in the media? What you hear in the media, you hear the word terrorist. And terrorist has a racial connotation to it. So when the gunman killed those people in Norway, did the American media call him a terrorist? He's a gunman. When the person shot the congresswoman and all those people, was he a terrorist? But if a Muslim does it, he's a terrorist. So the word terrorist does have a racial connotation. And this goes way back. This goes back thousands of years. What did the ancient Greeks call all non-Greeks? Barbarians. Any of you know where that word barbarian came from? Can't speak Greek. It was a way of making fun of how people talked. The Greeks believed that if you weren't speaking Greek, then when you talked, it sounded like you were saying bar, 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 bar. So they called those people barbarians. So making fun of how people talk and saying that they're making animal noises is a subtle way to dehumanize them. And my father, both of his parents were mostly black. They were from Virginia. My grandfather was a barber. My grandmother was a maid. And then their ancestors were slaves. And what is the most infamous dehumanization word in history? Nigger, right? Because if you want to oppress people and hurt people and enslave people, you have to portray them as subhuman. It's hard to do these things to people if they're like your daughter and your son and your family. So the word nigger, you see how you have to use these dehumanization terms to not just kill people, but to exploit people and to oppress people. Illegal alien. Right? Illegal alien. Right? Now, a more overt form of dehumanization can be seen during the Rwanda genocide. Have any of you seen the movie Hotel Rwanda? What do they call the people being massacred? Cockroaches. They call them cockroaches. So you see how it's easier to kill people and hurt people if they're cockroaches, or if they're barbarians, or if they're terrorists, or if they're niggers. Because human beings have this inherent empathy. And we have this inherent aversion to hurting our own kind. So you have to portray them as the other. The second form of distance is moral distance. Moral distance means I'm good, you're evil, and God is on my side. And that is why civil wars are so bloody. Civil wars are typically the most bloody wars in history. Because during a civil war, you look like the people you're fighting, you have the same language, customs, and traditions as them. So moral distance is used to make people believe that if you kill the enemy, you're expelling evil from the world. So psychological distance convinces people that they're not killing human beings, but subhumans and cockroaches. And moral distance convinces people that they're not killing human beings, but monsters and evil. So you're killing monsters, terrorists, evildoers, gangsters, right? Tyrants. The third form of distance is mechanical distance. Mechanical distance means that it's easier to drop a bomb on someone at 10,000 feet than it is to shoot them with a rifle at 300 yards. It's easier to shoot them with a rifle at 300 yards than it is to stab them with a knife at close range. So the farther away you are from someone, the easier it is to kill them. Right? It's easier to kill people if they look like ants from 10,000 feet than if they look like your mother or your father or your brother or your sister or your son or your daughter. If you kill somebody and the person reminds you of your son or your brother, it's hard to kill a person. And think about drones. What's easier? Killing people with a drone or stabbing a knife into someone's heart? The drone is much easier. It's a form of mechanical distance. And here's a question. Why did the Nazis use a gas chamber? Why did the Nazis use a gas chamber? It was a form of mechanical distance. There's a myth that the Nazis used a gas chamber because it was efficient. But there's nothing more efficient than a firing squad. There's nothing more efficient than lining people up, making them dig a ditch that will become their grave, making them stand in their grave, shooting them with inexpensive bullets, and throwing dirt on top of them. The Nazis killed nearly 1 million people, most of it firing squads. But they switched the gas chamber because so many Nazi soldiers were becoming traumatized from killing women and children. Imagine you're a Nazi soldier and you're killing women and children for 10 hours a day, every day. 2% can handle it, right? But the Nazi soldiers They have mothers. Many of them have sisters. Some of them have daughters. Very traumatizing. And there's all these accounts of Nazi commanders petitioning Heinrich Himmler, telling him we have to change the method of execution to protect the executioner. And if we have time for a question, we can talk about Rwanda, how it's a little bit different, but it's still very telling. But if you listen to these accounts from these Nazi commanders, we have to change the method of execution to protect the executioner. So it's all about protecting the executioner. When people are being executed, whether it's firing squad, or hanging, or electric chair, why are their faces almost always covered? Is it for their benefit? Are the executioners being nice? It's for the benefit of the executioner and people watching the execution, so they don't become traumatized. Because you don't want to look at someone's face when they're being electrocuted. Right? When gangsters execute people, where do they almost always shoot them? Back of the head. Back of the head. Gangsters, hard criminals, almost always shoot people in the back of the head because they don't want to see someone's face when they die. Think about how universal that is. In addition to the mechanical distance of the gas chamber, the Nazis also used psychological distance by calling people subhuman. And the Nazis also used moral distance by calling people evil. If the Nazis would have said all human beings are people like us, do you think the Holocaust would have ever happened? Of course not. A massacre as big as the Holocaust requires all three forms of dehumanization: psychological, moral, mechanical distance. But think about that. If human beings are naturally violent, why would every country in history, without a single exception, have to dehumanize the enemy in order to wage war? Why would every country in history, without one exception, have to create distance in order to wage war? And why would it be so hard to hurt or kill somebody if you see that person as a human being? If you look at somebody and think, that person's like me, it's very hard to hurt or kill them. If you look at somebody and think, that person has hopes and fears and dreams like I do, that person feels joy and pain like I do, if I kill that person, people will grieve, it's very hard to hurt or kill them. So I think the idea that we're not naturally violent, which all military history supports, is very uplifting, because it's also the idea that at our core we're not so bad after all, and that there is some hope for the human race. I'm not saying that people can't become violent. Look at the violent criminal population. The vast majority of people in the violent criminal population were abused as children. If you beat someone and abuse them, and you humiliate them, they become violent. If you beat a dog, the dog becomes vicious, right? That's how people become violent, through conditioning. And one of the best documentaries you can watch to see this is the documentary about Mike Tyson, called Tyson. Every peace person on earth should watch Tyson. He talks about how when he was a kid, he was a real small child, he was short, he was fat, and he wore glasses, and everybody picked on him. And the first altercation he ever had with another human being, these bullies took his glasses, put his glasses in the milk cart, and he ran. He said he was so afraid he just ran. And he talks about the first time he ever got in a fight. The first time he ever got in a fight, he used to raise these pigeons. And one day these bullies found his pigeons, and the bullies took one of his pigeons. And he said, give me my bird back. And the bully ripped the bird's head off and threw it at him. And Mike Tyson just went berserk and beat the kid up. And he was smaller, but he beat the bigger kid up. And my upbringing was very violent. My father had a lot of trauma. He was very violent. I was bullied a lot growing up. And I have a very violent temper. My temper was very violent. That's part of the reason I got into this whole peace thing, because I realized I had to figure something out, or I was going to do a lot of pain to people. But this is a common thing where, if you want to understand what makes people violent, it is a conditioning process: child abuse, neglect, societal effects, poverty, hopelessness, makes people violent. So I'm not saying people can't become violent. I'm saying I wasn't born violent. I became violent. Mike Tyson became violent. And the documentary Tyson is a really good case study about that.